Okay. Yeah. You're going to have to stop like a panther.
Move slow enough that the camera can follow you.
Oh, okay. Jared's got it covered. There's Jared, he's my producer. He's the one who's been taking care of the Place and Purpose podcast. Have you guys heard that yet? That's the one that I should talk into this thing. Jared, Wildbound PR, takes care of the Place and Purpose podcast that I've been doing for a year and a half now with the chairman of the Federated Indians of Great and Rancheria up there in Santa Rosa, and he and I get together once a month at the top of Sonoma Peak, where Coyote had the first tribe of the people of the Southern Pomo and the coastal Miwok. And we sit under these ancient bay laurels and we talk about what it means to be from anywhere, which I think we're going to kind of talk about today, Chris. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me.
It's really a pleasure, and just it's always really nice to have events here because I end up seeing friends I haven't seen in quite a long time. I think pre-pandemic for some of you. But for those of you who don't know me, my name's Chris Clark. I'm local. I am one half of the Desert Protection podcast, 90 Miles from Needles, along with my pal Alicia Pike, who's sitting over there.
Hi, Alicia.
And I'm a map geek. I wasn't quite old enough to enjoy blacklight posters back in the day, but when I was old enough to have walls that I could put stuff up on, instead of posters, sports, rock bands, whatever, I had maps. I remember I had, in the early 80s, I had the obligatory crowded apartment with a bunch of friends in Berkeley, and I don't even want to try and remember what the rent was because people will just start crying, but I had the obligatory mattress on the floor, right? And then right next to where my head was, where I would like fall asleep and wake up every day, I had a map of the contiguous U.S. by a map maker called Irwin Rice, R-A-I-S-Z, if you want to look him up. And he did amazing, very detailed, very meticulous pen and ink drawings of mountain ranges, the Black Hills, the Llano Estacado in Texas, the caterpillars marching north throughout all of Nevada. It was just an amazing, amazing thing. I mean,
That's what the mountain ranges look like.
Yep.
Almost as if they're casting shadows across the page inside and across their watersheds. Yeah.
Exactly. And so as a map geek, I'm used to the idea of an atlas being a certain thing. At its most basic, it's something that you look at if you want to find out how to get from point A to point B. And directions, alternative routes, all that kind of stuff. And those of us who live here in the Morongo Basin are probably going to be suspicious of something that calls itself an atlas of the desert, just because enough people know how to get here already, right?
Rightly so, yeah.
The deserts of California and its precursors are a really different kind of atlas. They are an atlas that tells you how to get to a frame of mind that is going to help you see the desert. And I just can't think of a better person to have here with us in Joshua Tree than Obi Kaufmann, the creator of the California Field Atlas series, and author and creative mind behind the deserts of California. So
Thank you,
please
brother.
welcome
Thank
Obi
you.
Kaufmann.
Okay. All right. All right. Thank you, Chris. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. We should talk about Rice's maps too. And thank you, man. I mean, you spent the past really 24 hours now talking to me. Yeah, we spent all last night over dinner talking about these things. And this morning, Alicia and Chris were so kind to have me as a guest on their podcast, which should be posted soon, I understand.
Within the next week, I would say.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so check that out. 90 Miles from Needles. If you're not familiar with the podcast, get with it. I mean, it's a soulful voice from the heart of the desert, whatever that means. But I think you nailed it on the head. But first, I want to say, MDLT, come on. Thank you so much for hosting this. Oh my goodness, come on. All of the
wonderful people here. I've been such a fan for such a long time. This is my second. Oh, hi, Frances. How are you? This is my second appearance here. My first one was when I did my first book, The California Field Atlas. That was the fall of 2016. We were going to have I was pretty sure that we were going to have our first female president at that point. Was some, what happened?
That universe branched off at some point.
Talk about the multiverse, branching timelines. But I knew there was only one place to have this discussion. And I imagined this sort of thing, and I wanted it to be a discussion, a conversation. That's why I invited my man Chris here to join me on stage, so that we might be able to jump into some pretty serious subjects pretty quickly. And I wanted a local community, okay? The local community gathered to get to sort of what Chris was intimating here, this thematic heart of the thing, which is like, I didn't want to make like a tour guide to California's deserts, I didn't want to tell anybody where anything is, which is a funny thing to say for a thing calling itself an atlas, right? I mean, I don't know why you need 72 hand-painted maps of the wilderness areas, across 4 different desert biomes. The only person who needs that is a local. The only person who wants that is somebody who this place speaks to, who understands the difference in their bones between the ecological character of Anza-Borrego Desert State Park as opposed to something like Mojave National Preserve. Very different entities these are, the nuance, the detail that is striking to those of us who actually spend time walking these precious arid lands and not just whizzing through them at 147 miles an hour, however fast people drive these days. But to actually defend and celebrate the character that is here, especially in the coming wake of this thing called the climate crisis or the biodiversity crisis. We're asking the desert to do so much, and the we in that particular context is the California citizen as they are represented politically, 1 in Sacramento and 2 in Washington, D.C. Right? The decisions that are made in land designations across this place, I lament. I mean, at one point in the beginning chapters of the book, I said I could have made these hand-painted maps, not with a paintbrush, but with a pair of scissors. Because it seems like that's how these designations are determined, rather chunky, like, really, without, as Chris, when I brought up this point with Chris earlier, it's like, well, maybe you want to take that point here. You put it so well this morning about the history, which my book doesn't touch on, right, of these places, which is a story in itself, right?
Well, what Obi's referring to is during the interview for the podcast, I started pontificating, as I do, on the fact that maps are thin slices of stories. And so you have a range map of a species that's a moment in time of the history of that species. It may have been somewhere completely different 8,000 years ago. It will be somewhere completely different in 200 years. And it's just a snapshot. Similarly for boundaries, the boundaries of wilderness areas, of national parks, of off-road vehicle recreation areas, of military bases, they all have stories behind them. Every little corner and niche and crevice and cherry stem in these designations have stories about people arguing over them. And it's just, there's just so much deep history to be read into maps, especially in a place like the desert where it hasn't really been human use patterns that have defined things so much as people, occasionally like myself, sitting in rooms deciding what we want to protect, deciding what we want to sacrifice. And so there's just a whole level of knowledge there that's just really fascinating to me, and probably to 2 or 3 other people in the world.
Right. I think early on in this discussion, like we are right now, I think it needs to be really pointed out and acknowledged that we are, 2 gray-bearded white dudes, and a lot of this history that you're referring to is that history, if you want to call a scant 100 years history, as opposed to the 6,000 or so years that we have archaeological evidence for the sophisticated technologies of, say, the Chemehuevi people who have lived in this place and have stewarded this land and have understood some sort of agreement inside of naturalized regimes of earth, air, fire, and water, and how they feed the person and the people. And that functioning, that communication, gosh, if I could just touch that justice, if I could in my work finally come to some semblance that is how do I be from here? Like it's not like it's going to be like some kind of destination. It's like, oh, okay, I'm finally over that line. I'm here. That's just not how it works. It's inherently a process. But it's a thought that gets me up out of bed every day, right? Deserts is something different, though, isn't it? I mean, we're talking about maps. Mm-hmm. We're talking about history. We're talking about the wounding of an ecology. Well, let me back up. The arbitrariness of geography as a template over the ecology cannot be overstated. The original wound, it seems to me, on a American designation began probably with Fremont, say, when he drew the line from Lake Tahoe to the Colorado River, which bisected the Mojave Desert, which is a contrivance that I perpetuate in my book in many regards, because we have to, because I really want to get to the bottom of what the Desert Resource Energy Conservation Plan is, the DRECP, which is really the law that governs what California is demanding of this precious and ultimately endangered place, right? And so what are we actually talking about when we're talking about how it is dissected, how it is analyzed, which I love that word analysis, which comes from a Latin etymology, which means actually to cut with a knife, as opposed to synthesis, which is the bringing together of things, which is, that gets to a larger story that I hope to tell. And God willing, I'm trying to tell a better story. I'd much rather tell a story than make a political argument. I'm not up here saying prescriptive things. I'm not up here on some political soapbox. I'm not running for anything. Okay? I'm not even presenting much of a scientific argument. That's not the story to tell. I'm really much more interested in inviting you along on this journey to understand how the ecological patterns fit together, how the puzzle works across different scales of history. Mm-hmm. And what we are looking at now, I mean, you guys, if you haven't listened to 90 Miles from Needles yet, there's one of their most recent episodes is about grief and loss, which is a tremendous zeitgeist. This thing with us, with us who love the desert, and we're wondering what is already gone, what remains, and what will be tattered, as it were. But has the Mojave ever been not tattered? I mean, one of Chris's, give us. Would you please give us your wonderful elevator pitch for the Joshua Tree?
Who's interviewing who here?
Well, the Joshua Tree. Give me, because you put it so well. This guy's studied this organism so fantastically.
Yep.
There's nobody better.
Well, for the last 25 years, I have been working on a book on Joshua trees that's going to be finished any day now for the last 25 years. And it's just, I mean, I had the idea as someone who was, like you are now, living in Oakland and coming to the desert whenever I could. And the book actually became an excuse for camping trips. Research time, gotta go. But the idea is just that the Joshua Tree, and maybe the Joshua Tree isn't unique in this, probably isn't. There are a lot of things about the Joshua Tree that are unlike anything else. But if you tie yourself metaphorically to the Joshua Tree on a short leash, you can talk about all these other topics. It just intersects with evolutionary theory, it intersects with human history, it intersects with human economy, with natural history of birds and insects. It's just, there's so much stuff that connects through the Joshua Tree. It's like a keystone species. It's also a keystone species for how I think of the desert in my head, because everything connects to that. So that's basically where I was with that. But
Right. Keystone species, ecological engineer, indicator species. It falls under all of these categorical designations, depending on what the application actually is to the story you're trying to tell. Over the past, the modern configuration, arboreal botanical configuration of the Mojave Desert is really only about 6,000 years old. Okay, so the Mojave Desert has existed one way or another. You can find 3 billion year old mountains in Death Valley. That's one level of geological conversation you can have with something called the Mojave, the hyperobject that is the Mojave Desert, right? But that's not the living desert. The living desert in its current configuration is actually a relatively modern construction, not much older than the age of the pyramids, really. And that's also true for most of the California floristic province. Everything on the west side of the Sierra Crest, including the transverse ranges and the peninsular ranges, and the configuration of arboreal types, for example. And I wonder, and as I make my way through the deserts of California, which exists as the third book in a trilogy, right? The California Lands trilogy, started with the forests of California, and then next the coasts of California, and then by way of parallel structure, I now have the pluralized deserts of California, right, where we go through the 4 great biomes of desert life and their orientation, trajectory, really, and celebrating always. Okay, so the biodiversity. Why biodiversity? And what is the character of the desert that I wish to express? What is this thing that is the Mojave? Which I think is a wonderful sort of existential foothold to hold on to here, especially in our conversation. If y'all want to go here, Chris and I are having this conversation here, but I'm encouraging you now to think of questions that you have, because we can go anywhere you want to go in this conversation. But I kind of like this inroad to the idea of defending and celebrating biodiversity in California's deserts, to not condemn to death, say, as we are that which is not dead. Okay, so right now, I'm working on my 6th book, which is going to be called The State of Fire, Understanding Where, How, and Why California Burns. And here we are in November of 2023, having just suffered the York Fire, which is out.
it is out. It took a while. It took out almost 100,000 acres of the Mojave Desert in Mojave National Preserve, Castle Mountains National Monument, and
not as many trees as the Dome Fire. Right, Dome Fire there's probably more trees there, right?
Probably, but it's such a much larger area that it's kind of hard for me to have a capsule judgment. I'm gonna wait for the Park Service to weigh in on that, because they have botanists and remote sensing. But it was catastrophic. Oddly, one place that got burned by the York Fire that people were worried about may be the best off, because that was Carruthers Canyon, which is a relict population of plants that are more commonly found on the coasts, ceanothus and manzanita and oaks and things like that, all of which are pretty much fire adapted.
That's right, fire adapted.
So
even fire dependent.
So Carruthers Canyon might be fine, but there's a lot of the rest of that area that is changed forever. And it's my friend Brendan over there, who's worthy of a hand because he is responsible for getting the Joshua trees legally protected in California. So thanks.
You were responsible for writing some of the law, is that right? The language?
To some degree?
Complicated story.
It's a complicated story. Always
Yep.
is. Thank you for your service.
But we were on the footprint of the Hackberry fire recently, which burned more than 70,000 acres of the preserve in '05, 18 years ago, 19 years ago. And it's beautiful. It's beautiful there. You can see that there was a fire, and the vegetation has changed dramatically. The Joshua trees are thinned out. There's maybe 1 in 40 that's still there. But there's stuff that has grown up since then that has been amazing. And you're talking about grief. We had that episode. I think one of the things that we have as something useful in our toolbox is recognizing that loss, as horrible as it can be and as permanent as it can be, does, at least in theory, open up the door for something new and beautiful. And that is happening in Mojave National Preserve at the moment.
Right.
If it keeps going that way, who knows?
Right.
But it's kind of an ethereal, hard to really grab onto and hold and feel good about the possibility that something nice might come up when you're watching the yuccas burn. And it's, but we got to find something,
That's right. That's right. Well, there is something about your attachment, your familiarity with this landscape. So these living objects, these beings, these particular individual trees, this habitat as I know it, as it is embedded in my heart, across my heart, that passes. And yet the thing that maybe we want to preserve and the great challenge is not preserving the particular configuration of the living objects themselves, but the patterns by which these successive clocks, these adaptive cycles that require fire on the landscape. Now there is a regime that, the dome fire was started with lightning. Lightning fires are going to happen in the desert, okay? But there is something that has passed, and this gets back to the existential character of the Mojave itself. What is the Mojave still the Mojave when now so covered in these invasive Eurasian grasses? And yeah, that's right. The cheatgrass and other species too that want to do one thing. They want to turn the whole world into the Eurasian steppe, and the Eurasian steppe wants to burn every 12 months. That's how these annuals propagate themselves, through the regular application of low intensity fire across the landscape. So they want to burn, and they want to destroy forests, and they want to expand their range. And they're here now, and this is what humans just do. They bring their livestock around the world, and with them come about 14 species of different grasses and forbs and whatnot. And these are very good at transforming native habitats into rangeland, for example, for grazers. And so now, it's like, gosh, what was the Mojave already before the York Fire so unrecognizable to itself, so deformed by these ultimately anthropogenic forces, these vectors of biological simplification, what am I actually mourning here? Like, was it, because it was just, at that point, it was just a clock that was ticking before the fire happened. Mojave was already different. And so what are the markers? What do we keep? What do we keep for ourselves? What does restoration mean? Restore to what? Restore to what? Now that we're thinking about Joshua Tree in the next 100 years, as the temperature slowly ticks up, and nights of frost, annual nights of frost, the daily count when nights get just cold enough in the winter of the high desert, where the Joshua Tree knows, okay, it's time for me to start to flower now. The Joshua Tree needs cold weather too. even though you think of it as a desert plant. But anybody, as you know, anybody from the desert knows that the desert gets very cold as it gets very hot.
So, a little bit of a departure and maybe a risk, but I have a question for you about the book.
Please.
You mentioned, you got into this a little bit, but the series is the California Field Atlas series, or the title of the book is The Deserts of California.
Right.
And California is a figment of our imagination, especially that one line.
Right.
The coast is real, and the Colorado River is real. But so that sets up kind of a conflict for you, because in order to be consistent with the other books, you're talking about California.
Right.
And in order to be ecologically literate, you have to talk about what's on the other side of that state line. So how did you approach that in conceiving of the book?
Right.
Great question. So I guess that comes down to the thing that is me, right? And where I come from. My father was an astrophysicist. My mother was a clinical psychologist, right? So, I remember driving in the car once when we were young, and I was in the back seat. My dad was driving. My mom was in the passenger seat, and I must have been 10 years old. And must have been one sort of inquisitive moment or a phase or something. I asked, I wonder where truth is hidden in the universe. Just one of these oblique questions from a kid. It's where is truth and what is it? And just right like that, my father said physics and my mom said psychology. It was just thank you for laughing. We still laugh about that. Yeah. I think if my adult self had been sitting next to my child self that day and I had the opportunity to answer that question to myself, sort of a strange circle to draw, but you get it. And I had the opportunity to answer, I would have said story. What is the story we're telling ourselves about our relationship to, let's call it reality. My father, Dr. Kaufmann's son, was going to be a mathematician. And this was, I was able to, growing up on the side of Mount Diablo in the northern Diablo ranges there in the Bay Area, I was able to break away from calculus homework to go, play with tarantulas and climb waterfalls and all that kind of stuff, which is where I cut my teeth as a very young naturalist. But and then lo and behold, he makes a painter. That's how I come out. But I'm realizing now, I make big books on nature. And it's funny, my father wrote college tech books with titles like Black Holes in Warped Space-Time or The Universe. And so my father was using the universe as his metaphor to understanding his relationship to reality. And I needed a tighter space. So I'm going to use California as a metaphor to hold all of my philosophies. And what are my philosophies? Well, my philosophies as they are presented in the books, and I think this is the philosophical structure that I built to describe this character of California that is manifest in the thing called the Field Atlas. It's built on three concepts. The first is a consilient aspect. And consilience is the word that Edward Wilson used in his great book from the 90s called Consilience, the Unity of All Knowledge, where you have these great schools of human thought, the physical sciences and the humanities, and together they form this overlapping, this Venn diagram, where inside that overlapping space you have a greater sense of knowledge, however quantifiable or qualifiable, right? So there's the consilience between the art and the science. Data-driven art. The second then would be complexity theory. Okay, so complexity theory is where, you have to follow me on this one. Complexity theory is where despair transforms into hope. Because what we're talking about here on a mathematical level is a dancing terrain of variables across any sort of matrix inside of any sort of configuration regarding time and space and phenomenology, what happens in time and space. In all complex systems, and they're all very different, what you get, a common feature, is the thing called the emergent phenomena. their emergences happen. Okay, so like California in 2023 is a very strange set of emergent phenomena, whatever they are. And if you look towards the future, as you consider how the past has gone, you come to some strange conclusions. Like it so happens that even though we have like, you know, the beautiful work of the Greta Thunbergs of the world in our face and in our hearts, you know, trying to really, you know, fight the catastrophic failure of carbon-based economies going forward, you know, and their unsustainability going forward into something called the 22nd century, if you will. We know, for example, over the past 10 years, with globally 75% of all coal plants have either been scrapped for production or have been taken offline. And because of that incredible statistic, it looks like we have avoided globally the worst effects of a runaway temperature gradient across the biosphere in excess of 4 to 8 degrees, which is, you know, anything over 1.5 degrees, according to the IPCC, is terrible. But it looks like because of that, we're going to avoid something like a 4-degree increase.
Turning the
global
planet
average.
into Venus, basically.
Right, exactly. That runaway. We've stopped that. That is an emergent phenomenon. That was like, despite all of our apparent paralytic incapacities on a political level, that is something that has happened. Okay, so let's monopolize on those things and let us tip these scales from catastrophic failure to something like catastrophic success. Okay, on whatever that may be, and that is a fight, and that is a fight, as you said most recently and so eloquently in one of your podcast episodes, the David Brower quote. How did it go about temporality and failure?
Right. David Brower, who is a leading environmental activist in the 1960s and 70s, I worked with him for a bit in the 90s, used to say the thing with environmental work is that all our victories are temporary and all our losses are permanent. And we pulled that apart a little bit last night. We were talking about one of Dave's big failures was a failure to keep the dam out of Glen Canyon, which then got flooded as a reservoir. And now we're talking about like actual non-freaky, non-environmentalist people are talking about draining Glen Canyon, and draining Lake Powell and restoring the river through there. So maybe not all defeats are permanent, but it sure seems like that. And when you have a whole lot of them coming all at once,
To a conservation biologist, extinction is a permanent
extinction
failure.
is permanent for sure.
I think that would probably be the only one. I can't think of others.
Planet destroying impact.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Sure. Well, that would be a cascading effect from this trajectory towards simplification. So defending the complexity. That's what we're talking about here. Biodiversity represents complexity. We don't know how it works yet. We need more scientists. We need more data. Just like as we were talking about today on the podcast, we need more love and data together. I know love is a squishy word. We'll have to get there. We'll have to get there, and I think I have an inroad to it in the third pillar of this ecological philosophical program that I'm laying out here in the book. We have consilience, you have complexity, and the third one is aesthetic theory. You know, what is it about these books? You know, I mean, when I started this long journey, I didn't really know what the first book was going to be. You know, I knew I wanted to have a book that said California on it. You just like a book that just said California, and then, you know, coyote eyes staring out at you. You know, what is going to be in this book? I didn't know what was going to be there. I just knew I wanted every page to drip with color and soul. And it's like, you know, that also like rang with this sense of joy, which I think is a spiritual process. You know, we're discussing it today. I don't really know what spirituality is. You know, I didn't grow up with any kind of religion. Remember physics and psychology? That was my jam. Apparently, still kind of is. I'm sort of locked in this thing, this rational thing. You know, and again, gosh, as we were saying, the biases that we bring by way of our own, racial configuration, sexual orientation, economic disposition, privilege, or whatnot in this thing called late stage capitalism, as it is affected across, this political system of neoliberal geopolitics. Like that's a particular perspective. That's a very specific cultural set of symbols that we all draw on. And we all talk this common language. Listen to me go on, and you guys seem to be following me. That's a very that's a community of people who are making sense, which is such a wonderful phrase. Making sense of what the information that I present, even in something like a watercolor of an eagle. What is the information that I am presenting there? What is the beauty that you are taking in? This idea of aesthetic arrest, this moment of where you are that eagle, kind of that moment when just in that right moment when you are the eye of the universe perceiving the thing of the universe, and the two are made one. That transcends the story. That transcends definition. That transcends time and space. Although it is very specific cultural semiotics to get really sort of Chomsky on you, But what are you transmitting? What is the sign? What is the symbol? Well, the symbol is a connection on a human level. I mean, Wilson might call it biophilia. Mm-hmm. We're hardwired to love this thing. So let's just keep the focus there, as opposed to surrendering our will, our attention, our endless capacity to, fix our dopamine.
Doom
scrolling, giving it all to the algorithm. Let's deny that, and that I think is found in even the thing that is the book. There's an effect there that I will say is qualifiably better than the phone thing.
Mm-hmm. And having said that, I can wholeheartedly recommend Obi's Instagram feed, Coyote Thunder. It's really, really good.
Thank you.
We need to wrap up and go into questions, but just really briefly, I can say this as someone who used to be a Bay Area environmental activist, but Bay Area environmentalists have not always done the best job of thinking about the desert, of managing the desert, of proposing plans for the desert. And I am just so grateful for this book, because it's someone, you're not outside the desert, certainly not now. You think about the desert, you're familiar with it, and as a voice from somewhere else, to treat the desert with as much respect and affection as this book has. It's just a wonderful, wonderful gift to those of us who have been sitting here wondering if anybody really gets it. That's not here. And so just thank you so much for this book. It's just, it's a wonderful gift for us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you. I appreciate that. I don't feel like I've really begun to fight. And also I'd like to eschew even the moniker of environmentalism. I think that word has really been co-opted into this divisive rhetoric that we're spoon-fed by the algorithm to keep us at odds with one another. And there's so much money being made at us being at odds with one another, however you want to divide us, rural, urban, probably the big one would be red and blue, right? Yeah. It's like, I don't know what democracy is, but it kind of feels like this, and I know that the solutions must be democratic ultimately, because I can't think of any other way to do it that makes any sense at all. Yeah. So the democratization of these places, of these geographies, is really core. I'm not just talking about, as I say, not a tour guide, right? Mm-hmm. It's not just about the superlatives of the desert. It's not just about one town or another town, or there's not much talk of towns.
You don't mention Barstow at all. I noticed that.
Oh, I don't.
So did the guy in the audience who's from Barstow.
Oh. Right. Well, that gets back to the character of the field atlas that I'm trying to describe. That which has always been here, continues to be, and will always be, despite our infrastructural imposition upon the landscape. The scars that we leave. The Amargosa River is 2.5 million years old. That water, it's old water. 50 species live there that don't live anywhere else. Different organisms. It's a sacred spot. This is a sacred spot. The town is a living community of humans. And although seems to be spawning this novel ecosystem of starlings and ravens and a sort of bloated population of other various mammals, apart from Homo sapiens, there is a novel ecosystem there. You look into the books of like Charles Hood. He's really a wonderful naturalist as far as that investigation goes into the field guides of what is happening right now in the desert. That's not my book, right? I'm thinking of these larger patterns. How do I be from here, and what does here actually mean? Well, you have to study ecology to answer that question, I think. Question mark? Okay, that all being said, should we turn it to questions?
Yeah, how are we handling this? Ella, are you monitoring this, handing the mic around? Or?
Yeah, we have some questions that have come in online or indirectly, remotely.
Thank you to the
virtual
virtual
world. If there's
world.
anyone here who has questions in person, I can come to you.
I would love it.
Yeah, we have one.
There's
over
Stephen.
here.
Stephen Savage.
Here, I've got a mic for you.
I have a definitive love for the entire deserts, Great Basin, Mojave. What is your opinion on these watering projects? They just had one started last month. Fortunately, it's in an area of not natural beauty north of Lancaster, and they're putting in now 70,000 acre feet of water.
The
That's
water
all fine
bank.
and well,
The water
because
bank.
obviously it was already pre-purposed for another use. But what do you guys feel about like Warner Valley that was proposed to be flooded underground, for 250,000 acre feet of water? But with that, you would have roads, human beings, equipment, pumps, electrical power. How do you feel about that whole concept about burying water in the Mojave?
That's a great question. You want to shoot that first, Chris?
I can answer in one sentence, which is that I've spent a lot of the last 20 years fighting the Cadiz water mining project, which is sort of the canonical example of what you're talking about, including the groundwater recharge aspect of things. So it's when we get to thinking of the driest place in the U.S. as a source of water, we're doing it wrong. So, yeah.
Right. Well, I'm talking to Stephen over here. You were just telling me that you've done the Colorado River. You've done Grand Canyon 100-something times. Right. Okay. So you know the river. I mean, one of my favorite books ever. And if you want a good adventure story, I don't know if you've read it, by Wallace Stegner's Beyond the 100th Meridian. I mean, that rivals Lord of the Rings for like, what is going on with this Civil War general with one arm in wooden boats going down the first tour down the Colorado River?
He did it single-handed too.
Yeah, one arm. Oh, it's harrowing, and the details are fantastic. But most interestingly, I believe, is that he is also the first director of the United States Geologic Survey, USGS, and he wrote this great map, and I reproduce it in the back of my book here. This great map of how, based on his very prescient observation that water and aridity will always define human community and settlement in the West. And he advocated for state lines actually to be drawn around watershed applications as opposed to how county lines, for example, are usually like some Spanish land trust and some creek and some, other ley line or whatever. And it's so arbitrary. So now, as we were pointing out, like Los Angeles County bleeds over into Antelope Valley, and it's a mess it's an unfocused mess. And it's going to lead to emergent phenomena, like doing potentially absurd things, like exploiting the desert of the water. I go through it pretty extensively in my book here, where the idea, and this gets back to a whole psychology of what the desert is. It is a place of space, which is perhaps its most like valuable resource as an economic entity. We can put things there. We can put 250,000 acres of solar panels, which is what we're planning on doing. California's planning on doing in the next 7 years. It's a massive infrastructural development that brings up the question, which I think gets to this whole water extraction policy too. The question is, are we spending nature to save nature? And how exactly does that work? What are we saving? If we're just transforming industry from one thing into the next, and we're considering on, and we're just trudging on with our consumerist, or as Wendell Berry puts it, industrial fundamentalism, right? Yeah, this paradigm of extraction, this linear economy where we build things, we use them, and then we put them back into the ground and call it garbage. What a terrible system that is. As opposed to something that might look like this. He says as he traces a circle in the air. The absurdities abound, and I think that water extraction and water storage too in the desert is remarkable. Where does water conservation actually? Well, there's a law of utilitarian progress, Ebbets law, which says that the more you conserve, the more you will use. Okay, so so as now we have just planted. Over the past 5 years, we've planted about 250,000 acres of almonds in the Westlands Water District of the Western San Joaquin Valley. And that has resulted in effect to us being California, exporting in the form of an almond the tune of about 3 million acre feet of water a year to China, who is the main buyer of this almond industry. Benefiting, these are not mom and pop operations in the San Joaquin Valley. Specifically, I'm talking about a few brands that are benefiting a couple of families in Beverly Hills, which are real estate moguls. They're not farmers. So we've got some core negotiation to do in order to tackle some of these large issues like what water is. But what makes that possible is water conservation. Now that we have micro irrigation, our irrigation technology is such that we can put a drop of water exactly where we need the drop of water to go. So we're doing way more with way less, right? And so that is problematic. And that will work itself out somehow, because we are in the bottleneck now, my friends. We're in the bottleneck. So many stresses, like I just described, one system of extraction, of exploitation, of economic disparity, of ecological stress. That will work itself out somehow as we're dragged through this bottleneck over the next couple of decades, I believe. I believe it's all going to be worked out in the next couple of decades. Sufficient data and probably sufficient love as well for some sort of common vision that is either imposed from within or without, that takes us to the next chapter. As just to address water a little bit more, because I love talking about water. I can talk about water all day long. What we've done with water as Californians in the past 90 years or so rivals anything that humans have done anywhere with anything. I put it up against the pyramids. I'll put it up against the Great Wall of China. As far as like manpower, infrastructural transformation, landscape transformation. It's the most altered aspect of our natural topography. It's like the waterscape of California. The number one customer of electricity in California is water. Because we pump it all 400 miles up mountains and over mountains to Los Angeles. It's an amazing thing. But I think that great success will only be met and rivaled by how we transform it again over the next 90 years, as we're going to have to do. And there's big decisions on the table right now. Very exciting decisions to be made, because I think that we're up to the challenge. But because what other choice do we have? You know, and I think I'm just going to leave it there for that.
Yep, we should get on to another question.
Oh, on to another question. All right.
Yep.
Anybody else have?
Does anyone else have a question?
Oh yeah.
So if in our multi-universe that steers off to another line,
Oh, that's a
if
good
you
one.
had complete power of California, what are 2 things you would do now that would make California a better place environmentally in 100 years from now?
Wonderful. I love that idea. Okay, the question is, what are 2 things that we can do? 2 things. You want 2 things. Okay. Well, Wendell says 2 things that we can do for a 100-year time scope, which is a very interesting length of time. That's really like the human length of time, isn't it? Right? Like in our lifetime, or our kids' lifetime, you know, potentially the first person to live to 130 years old is already alive on the planet. You know, that kind of thing is kind of a fun thing to think about. But it's really like, as we're seeing the Earth unfold for the first time in human time, the climate is changing so rapidly. It's transforming before our eyes. It's horrifying. I think there's a psychological effect of that. What can we do? Or we could put it another way. What can we do to leave the natural world of California in a better state at the end of the 21st century than, say, we left it at the 20th century? Right? How can we make that happen? What is the roadmap to get us there? Wendell Berry says, solving for pattern is the way to go. And he was talking specifically about the richness of, say, topsoil. The richness being a measure of biodiversity within, you know, the complexity of that soil. The more complex the soil, the more resilient it is to whatever pathogen, whatever stress vector you throw at it, right? And it's the same thing here. You know, we talk a lot about the climate crisis, but that goes hand in hand with the biodiversity crisis. You know, every single one of our natural landscape types in California is threatened, endangered, or critically endangered. Every single one of them. Except right now, California has a very low extinction rate. It's actually less than 1%. Now, I'm not talking about the extinction threat. That's horrifying. But and it's very dangerous for scientists to label an animal extinct, although we've seen some of these are moving that way. Some of these species, I think most specifically about like the Delta smelt, which is a huge contentious species, right? But what that means is that there is a miracle to steward here, okay? Despite all the degradation that we have implemented, all of the fragmentation, all of the, you know, all the pieces are still on the board. Okay, so holding on to that biodiversity, because this is humbleness, my friend. You know, this is humility. This is like recognizing that what we don't know dwarfs what we do, especially in the field of ecology. Ecology is a very young story to be told. I mean, it's astounding to me. Like in 1968, MacArthur and Wilson wrote The Theory of Island Biogeography, which is really sort of like the first book that gave us a theory about speciation at all. You know, Darwin's book on the origin of species didn't actually explain the origin of species. It didn't do what its title said it did. You know, he explains evolution by way of natural selection, but it wasn't really applied until this book, arguably 20 years after we understood what DNA was, right? I mean, we understood so much, but we still didn't understand like some pretty basic ecology. Like 1968, that's like, you know, people were in this room were alive then, you know, and this is our first like real understanding of how species occur. Like it's the first application of Darwinian theory to the environment. Like Like that's you know, and that's great. Like that gives me great hope and pause when I tell the Greta Thunbergs of the world, it's like it is happening very fast. You know, I mean, it's only in the past 20 years that academically fire ecology has been removed from forestry as an academic study. You know, that it's its own thing now, as removed from the commodification of this thing called timber, right? So, you know, the story is moving very fast, and I can't wait. And I hope, talking about emergent phenomenon, I think we're kind of waiting for the next Darwin, and she's going to explain to us how cooperation works mathematically in an ecosystem, as opposed to the idea of, like, you know, the Tennyson idea of nature written tooth and claw, right? This idea like everybody's just like in competition all the time. It's like, okay, well, that's on some scale that makes sense, and it works on some systems, but there's something else going on there too. There's a lot of interconnectedness. In fact, the interconnectedness is so complete that it forms this sort of like biological dark matter. You hear that, like, cosmologists talking about dark matter. Like, we don't understand how, like, galaxies really work because we can't account for all the mass in the universe. And it seems to be the same way with life, like, say, in the ground, like how cryptobiotic soils might work, or mycelial networks might inform growth patterns through tree forest networks, how they take care of each other, how they talk to each other, how they seem to act rather like vertebrate animals in the way they seem to be able to talk, see, breathe, like some interesting stuff. So again, I'm just gonna have to go back to solving for pattern, more data, more love. You know, something about traditional ecological knowledge, the other tech, you know, TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, dovetailed into scientific innovation, you know, and we see this resurgence as well. This emergent phenomena that really in the past 5 years in Sacramento, tribal scientists and tribal cultures have a seat at the table like they never have had in California, and that voice is being heard, and representation for the first time in our state's history is actually occurring, and that hope written on the landscape. Oh, come on. You know, that's the goodness. So, you know, I'm short like the one kind of thing because it's a network of systems. I don't know. What do you want to say about that? What would you do?
Well, yeah, I think the tendency now, one of the things I'm working on, actually Luke's doing more of the work, thanks Luke, is trying to get the Chuckwalla National Monument established south of Joshua Tree. And when you work on protecting lands these days, you have to have the tribes at the table. You have to have them, in fact, at the head of the table and leading the effort. And that's just such a promising thing to me. Because, I mean, TEK isn't the answer to all of our problems, you know, but when you think about the fact that these ecosystems were created by people that lived here before us old white guys with gray in our beards moved here, it just makes sense to ask the architects for the blueprints.
Yeah. That's good. That's
Yeah.
good. That's really good. Yeah, next month on Place and Purpose, we're having a ecologist whose name is Adina Marinlander, and Adina was the one who wrote the California Naturalists Handbook, and she also wrote a book called Corridor Ecology, right? So now we're in the 30 by 30 plan, which is a baseline, remember, protecting 30% of California's lands and waters by the year 2030. That must be a baseline to something that might be like a 50 by 50, right? As we're really understanding how connectivity works across the landscape to protect populations and genetic diversity. There's 3 types of biodiversity, right? There's species biodiversity, ecological biodiversity, and genetic biodiversity. We have to protect all 3. And she also just finished she finished writing, and now you can become a certified California climate steward through the UC Berkeley Naturalist program. So I encourage you all to check out that fine that excellent certification program. You know, the more climate stewards we have who understand this idea of like corridor ecology, connectivity within the landscape, which Chuckwalla represents.
Yep.
You know, that's exactly a missing piece of the puzzle. You know, for a great number of species, to protect them from development, to protect their migration corridors. So many vertebral mammals and birds need this space, need this land area locked up.
Yep.
Locked up and protected from economic development, from economic extraction. And that's what we're working for. Yeah.
Okay, more questions?
Next question. Oh, yes. Yeah. Sarah Jane.
I'm just loud.
Sarah Jane.
Yes, I hope you don't mind. I'm asking a little bit off the ecological front.
Please.
Having looked at several of your books,
Yeah.
I'm just curious if you would talk for a moment about your practice.
Oh.
Do you do plein air?
Mm-hmm.
You know, are journaling pieces done out in the field? Are they done in the studio? Just
Yeah, it's all in the studio.
there's art here.
Thank you so much. You know, I mean, I'm planning after I get this State of Fire book done, finally to like, I'm going to spend 2025 walking. I think it's going to be a walking book tour. I need to get you. It's a funny thing, this blessing and this curse, to have like, you know, kind of a series that like my publisher's really excited about, you know, so get to work. So I'm putting these things out every 18 months or so, right? So it becomes a 7-day a week, 5 a.m. to 10 p.m. kind of job, you know, and I have a little dog, and she insists that I walk her every hour, and that really is, you know, keeps me alive. But this whole thing where I am attempting to simplify my own practice, you know, the practice is the thing that you become, right? Between the writing, the reading, I'm a voracious reader. I need to read books and books and books. It really sucks when I have to move, but that's just the way it is. Writing, reading, painting, walking. Those 4 things sort of like meld together to become the same thing. You know, walking through the chapters of the environment as they unfold around me, or walking across the page through the printed ink, or even just like letting the pen flow like paint as I'm in my handwriting, right? So like it all sort of comes together in this conciliant act of study, always attempting to get better, I suppose, or at least hone. I would say more, it's like sort of, I've got my defending the defensible space around my house. How about that for a fire metaphor, right? Like what is my house? My house is my brand, my voice, my expression, the manifestation of that voice in a academic field with relative distance to other researchers who might be presenting similar information, but I want to deconstruct the idea of the expert and rather sort of invite you along on this journey, not to present a textbook, but rather to, the first line of this book is that this is an adventure story. I want it to be I want it to live there. You know, I want it to live in your heart, because that's where it is for me. It's ultimately not a mental exercise. This is not a work of science, if you will, even, right? Because I'm not restricted to that modology. I need the license and the shield that comes from this aesthetic theory, that comes from this presentation that is born out of love, out of beauty, and appreciation for the value of those things, co-equal with, getting the data right. So that's the endeavor.
All right. I think another way to say that is something that you said last night as we were chatting, which is that I'm writing my next book on fire.
It's funny you didn't point that out, but yeah. I mean, I say, and I've written things like, life is the thing that burns. It could be that fire is unique to this planet, to this biosphere. You know, that thing in the sky, that's not combustion. That's atomic fire. It's totally different. Fire needs life to burn, to happen at all. You know, you talk about the atmosphere, the air. You talk about the hydrosphere, the water. You talk about the geosphere or the lithosphere. There's no pyrosphere.
Right.
It's the biosphere. And on the essentialized Platonic element, life and fire in the same piece. Life is the thing that burns. And across California, it's so complete. Ecologically, that story, that circle is so complete and so integral that I'm fine to say things like, in California, trees are fire waiting to burn. You know, so that fundamental story there, associating life and fire, is a way to get right with fire. I don't really know what getting right with fire is, but I know we're going to have to do it because there's a lot more coming. I gotta tell you, you know, historically, you examine the history of megafire across California, and historically, after extremely wet seasons over the past several thousand years, that's when the big fires hit. I'm really concerned about the fire seasons of 2025, 2026. You know, here we are dreading with remembrance the fire year of 2020 when California saw almost 4 million acres burn. Historically, it looks like something between 6 and 10 million acres burned per year. It's weird to say that. Especially in Northern California, we're still woefully fire deficient in these regular return intervals. There's so much land up there that hasn't burned. That getting to, like, it could be, we wake up in October of 2026 and we're doing 6 to 8 million acres. You know, I mean, that could, just, you know, forewarned, forearmed, you know. Whatever happens, we're going to need you not panicked, you know. You know. Right, exactly.
Well.
Okay,
I
well,
think
that's a cheery.
it.
Let's not end on
Yep.
that.
Who else we got?
Yeah, one last question. One more.
Or if you got some.
Well, we have one from online that was a little more lighthearted.
Please.
Yeah, we hear you're a fan of the series Dune,
Oh, yeah.
and wonder if that played into your composition of this book on California's deserts.
Yeah. I mean, Dune was fascinating. Frank Herbert, Dune. You know, 3 authors in my mind, science fiction authors who really influenced my work would be, well, 2 of them are science fiction. Well, Ursula Le Guin would be another one. You know, that's sort of science fiction. You know, she wrote a book called "The Word for World is Forest," and this is what James Cameron used for Avatar. But it didn't end the same way. In her book, after the mining wars against the indigenous populations, the indigenous perspective asked, what are we to do now that we know how to murder? It's not like we can go back and just be us, right? Which is a fascinating. So then we got Frank Herbert. We got Dune, the first real science fiction novel to like have a planetary ecologist as one of the characters, right? In this, it never made a lot of sense to me in this world without water. It's like, well, that's not going to work. I don't know how. Well, I mean, we could talk about how there were underground caches of water, which is why they're able to sustain these enormous invertebrates called the worms. You know, Shai Hulud and all that. But I think that his book was really a systems analysis of governments and political corruption and that kind of thing more than it was any sort of ecological treatise. But the books that really get me, and they still do, are Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Like, I'm a huge Middle Earth guy. And in fact, when I first started writing these books, well, before I started writing them, I in my pitch meeting for the first book, The California Field Atlas, I took Tolkien's little map of, you know, Middle Earth with the trees over here and the mountains over here, you know, that kind of thing. And I'm like, I'm going to do that for a place that is more romantic, more epic, more full of crazy monsters than Middle Earth or anything made up could ever be, and it actually exists, and I'm actually from there. And describing it that way is a great source of inspiration, right?
Plus, you met
continues-
my direwolf this morning.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. That's a big dog, Jack. Oh, indeed, right on. Well, thank you for that question, person online. Anything up there? Anything else? Are we gonna wrap it up? I think we're gonna wrap it up, Chris. I gotta say once again, thank you so much.
Wouldn't have missed it.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys. Thank you. And thank you, MDLT. Your tickets all go to them tonight, so support them. I really appreciate you all being here. And if you haven't signed my book over there, please do. Oh, it's right here. But I think I got just a couple of copies left if anybody needs one. But I'll be hanging out for a bit. All righty. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
All right.